safeguarding investigation by the local council and eventually a finding of neglect. One of many such cases. But how might we account for such very poor care of older people? Time to turn to a paper published in the Sociological Review journal under the title Dirt, Decency and the Symbolic Boundaries of Caregiving in Residential Homes for Older People. And its author is Eleanor Johnson, who's Research Fellow at the Bristol University School for Policy Studies. And Eleanor now joins me. Eleanor, you conducted your research in a local authority area in the south of England. You studied 2 care homes, both of which are given anonymised names. Milstead is a single private residential home identified as low cost, whereas Shorefield, your second one, was a large-scale corporate home provider marketed as a luxury alternative to more traditional care homes. And you spent around 800 hours as a participant observer over 2 years, including taking on the role of care worker for 12 months. What were you hoping to find out?
Before I started the research, I'd come across the argument that the care sector in the UK was becoming polarised. So with high cost, high quality care at one end of the market and low cost, low quality care at the other. And I wanted to find out if that link was there and how that might have played out in the day-to-day running of care homes. So what factors might contribute to the provision of good and bad quality care.
Now tell me about the ways that empty space, a term first coined by sociologist Emil Durkheim, was regarded differently at the two homes.
In Durkheim's work, this empty space referred to something that surrounds all people. He spoke about moral individualism, which refers to a morality that's characterised by respect for that empty space. So an acknowledgement of it, a careful treatment of the boundaries that surround a person, which sort of protect and sacralise them. So one of the things that I looked at in my study was how the space around people who were receiving care was treated in two different homes. And that included their physical bodies and also materials and possessions and spaces that they occupied. What we might expect if someone is being treated in a kind of morally individualised way, we'd expect that when boundaries are crossed into, say, someone's room or by moving their possessions, that there would be certain rituals and routines taking place to maintain that individual's honour. So in the case of, say, cleaning continence pads or commodes being moved around a particular space, we would expect that, for example, they wouldn't be moved between two different residents' bedrooms because they kind of symbolise part of that person, if that makes sense. So a bit like how we look at other possessions, you wouldn't move someone's handbag, for example, into another space. So this might be simple routines like knocking the bedroom door or closing curtains to ensure a person's privacy. Or it could be more subtle things that take place when someone's providing bodily care. So, for example, placing a towel over certain parts of someone's naked body while washing other parts of their body so that they're not left completely exposed. So at Milstead, the low-cost home, even the very basics of that kind of boundary maintenance seemed to be missing. So, for example, I wrote about how one person's bedroom was used for its supply of hot water and another bedroom was used as a communal toilet because it was very close to the residents' lounge. And there was no real sense amongst the care workers there that they needed to mark the crossing of any kind of boundary into someone's private individual space. And they often wouldn't even acknowledge that there was a person present when they entered those spaces.
You use the phrase moral individualism in relation to Shorefield and talk about this particular ethos lacking at Milstead. Give me some more examples.
One example was how, in order to save money, Milstead's manager only allowed care workers to use 2 clinical waste bags to gather used incontinence pads in each 8-hour shift. Now, that's very few. That's basically a big yellow plastic bag. And that basically meant that those bags containing bodily waste were carried in and out of residents' bedrooms, really left in corridors for hours until they were completely full. There were few toilets and waste disposal facilities. There were small private living spaces and long corridors. And all of these things made the discreet movement of bodily waste and things like soiled incontinence pads impossible, really. You couldn't get rid of anything like that without entering a communal space. Whereas at Shorefield, that simply didn't happen because each resident had their own ensuite with its own sealed clinical waste bin.
Some of the techniques at Shorefield were just following the national guidelines on infection, but you talk about others as more obviously symbolic. What do you mean?
Before leaving a bedroom and entering communal space at Shorefield, Care workers removed their gloves, they washed their hands, and items were ordered, concealed, and disposed of. Those tasks didn't just relate to the spread of possible pathogens or diseases. They also maintained a symbolic boundary between dirty and clean, or private and communal spaces. So, for example, we'd expect care workers to wash their hands and to remove their gloves. But Shawfield's care workers also concealed all of the items that were involved in bodily care before they left someone's bedroom. So things like hairbrushes and creams. So spaces were kind of restored to being clean.
Let's turn to Milstead again. Could you read your written observation about your very first shift here?
There is no peace, no retreat from the chaos. There is no attempt to conceal what is happening. Residents are left sitting naked and soiled on commodes in the middle of cold rooms with their doors open for all to see. Care workers walk in and out of residents' bedrooms as they are being changed or bathed without acknowledgement. Yellow bags full of feces and stale urine soak pads are left on the floors of the corridor and are lugged in and out of bedrooms and up and down the stairs. Residents shout out for assistance but are often ignored. The care workers appear unmoved by the sights, sounds and smells, which I find overwhelming.
Now, I can imagine the listeners listening to that would feel a bit of distress about your account, or even perhaps feel some anger towards the care workers who they might see as responsible for these conditions. But you want to suggest that their acceptance of dirt by these care workers, we can't simply read this as indicative of wickedness or moral failure. I mean, why are such readings wrong?
We shouldn't just read stories like this as tales of saints and monsters. And this is where I think there are also some connections to Eyal's work as well. It's not to deny that toxic work practices and forms of horrific abuse occur. We know that they do through research and through media reports, like you mentioned earlier. But I think looking at the role of things like space and architecture in how care is provided allows us to see how poor quality care in environments like Milstead isn't just a result of a workforce with no ethic. And in fact, many of the care workers who I spoke to were clearly demoralised by their inability to carry out care in the way that they wanted to. I hope what my research shows is that if care work is to be underpinned by a concern for the dignity of people, then care workers need sufficient time, as well as access to adequate space and material resources. And that isn't happening at places like Milstead.
I want to bring your work now into alignment with another piece of work by the distinguished sociologist Irving Goffman, his book Asylums, Essays on the Social Situation of Mental Patients and Other Inmates. Because you say that Milstead displayed many of the degrading characteristics that Goffman found typical of some psychiatric wards. What were these characteristics?
Residents being left sitting naked with doors open and that kind of bodily waste being everywhere around the home. But I also found that care workers would often shout across the lounge to ask residents if they needed the toilet. In communal spaces, residents would sometimes be told that they were wearing an incontinence pad, and so it was fine for them to remain where they were sat to go to the toilet rather than actually going to the bathroom. Drawing upon Goffman, I argue that workers appeared to be almost preoccupied with the instrumental requirements of the job. So basically making sure that everyone was washed, dressed and fed, rather than focusing on the symbolic and the ceremonial. And Goffman spoke about how that can result in what he called non-person treatment.
What did you conclude about the reasons for some of the harm, some of the neglect, some of the lack of respect for residents that you've identified in your study?
This is in part a story of an inequitable care market, which is worsened by increasing commodification and market polarisation of care services. But I think also it's too simple to say that neglect exists only in economic terms. So we have to locate the delivery of care within the broader social context too. So I think what I observed at Milstead to a degree reflects the ongoing violence and neglect of marginalised populations, such as older and disabled people. And research has often shown us how older people are stripped of humanity and respect, irrespective of poor resourcing.
Eleanor Johnson, thank you very much for talking to me. A quick reminder, by the way, that the names of the residential homes used by my guests were anonymised. We've been talking about neglected workers, invisible, degraded workers. Let me give the last words to Bertolt Brecht, as cited by Studs Terkel in Working. Brecht wrote, "Who built the 7 towers of Thebes? The books are filled with the names of kings. Was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? In the evening, when the Chinese wall was finished, where did the masons go?"
Thinking Aloud is presented by Laurie Taylor and produced by Jane Edgerton.
Rethink. Earth is heating up.
Losses and damages from climate change are going to happen everywhere for the next 10 years to come.
If we don't change the way we live, scientists say more extreme weather events will hit the planet.
The estimates of how much investment's needed is around $5 trillion per year.
What has to happen to mitigate the effects of global warming, and what lifestyle changes will we have to swallow to get them done?
The first people who have to do that are Western countries.
Rethink Climate, with me, Amal Rajan, on Radio 4. Now available on BBC Sounds.
And now on Radio 4, here's Katie Razzle with The Media Show.
Hello. This week I'm talking with Michelle Donelan, Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. She is the 11th Conservative in the role since the party took power, and she has a huge remit. From the tech companies to museums and art galleries to broadcasters like Channel 4, whose privatisation she halted just last week, and even Eurovision. But before we get into all of that, I wanted to get a sense of her news habits. How does she keep up to date through the working day? And there's a mention here right at the start to checking Playbook first thing in the mornings. That's a daily newsletter produced by the political magazine Politico, in case you decide you want to mimic the minister's media habits.
Yes, so I wake up and I look through Playbook, or as soon as it's come out, I look through Playbook. I will watch a bit of Sky News or BBC while I'm getting ready in the morning. Obviously then try and stay alert throughout the day and see what else is happening, and then I'll read the papers at some point, either probably in the evening as well.
And what about streaming services? Do you have a lot of subscriptions? Are you a Netflix, Disney Plus, what person?
We've got Netflix and Amazon Prime in my household, so watch a bit of both. They're really good for unwinding. I find that I prefer the things that don't take too much brain power. When you've been through a lot of legislation or different policies, it's nice to just relax sometimes.
When you can. Well, look, you've been Secretary of State at the DCMS for 4 months now, and you've recently announced a big U-turn, a big policy U-turn. Why have you decided not to privatise Channel 4?
So I think I agree with my predecessor and many other predecessors that have looked at this issue before, that there are long-term sustainability issues and threats to Channel 4. We know that it is a dramatically changing media landscape out there, which you'll be only too familiar with. We know that linear advertising is taking a hit. Organisations are having to evolve and adapt and become more dynamic to cope with that, and Channel 4 have a very rigid business model. The public broadcaster restrictions, for one, don't allow them to create their own content, which means that their ability to flourish is capped from the off. And that sustainability fueled the decision under